The following lecture will be about the nature and some modes of logic and logical thinking. In other words, it would be a sort of clarification of the way human beings build arguments. The basic concepts of logic are arguments, premises, conclusions. Those are the essential three. The argument is a movement of mind from some statements accepted as already known, and those are called premises, to the so-called conclusion. Conclusion is this: what has to be proven in the process of thinking, because philosophy essentially is a process of thought, of vision, of building theories and explaining the universe on the basis of reality. Therefore, logic is very essential and very important. In every day we use logic, of course, too. Not necessarily always and in a proper way, but we do think. So, we have the procedure of the mind from some statements which we call premises to the one which we call conclusion. Conclusion is this: we want to prove in a logical way. Premises, therefore, are accepted as true, and if they are true, and if the mind follows the rules of thinking, we arrive at what we call conclusion. Arguments, therefore, are ways of showing the evidence for some theory, some vision, some statement, whether it be very abstract or also very concrete. Basically, there are two modes of logical argumentation. The one is called deductive thinking or deductive argument. A deductive argument consists of two premises and the conclusion, the third statement, which we call conclusion. Deductive argument guarantees the truth of the conclusion, provided that the mind follows the rules of valid thinking. Validity, however, has to be joined to the truth in conclusions. If, therefore, we have valid thinking, valid procedure in the process of argumentation, and also true premises, then we have the two basic conditions. The argument is valid and the premises are true, and the premise or the argument rather, is called sound argument. A sound argument is an argument in which the rules of thinking are preserved and the premises are true. So we can give some examples now about deductive argumentation. Deductive method consists of 3 statements, 2 premises and 1 conclusion. It is essential, however, that we follow some rules in the process of deduction. There can only be 3 statements, both in sense and in number. There cannot be more than 3 basic concepts implied. That's one. Second, the conclusion cannot assert more than it is contained already in the premises. The middle term will never appear in conclusion. Next, one of the premises, and this is important in deduction, one of the premises must be a universal statement with the prefix all or none. Basically all. If we have 2 positive assertive premises, then we can never arrive at a negative conclusion. Next, if both premises are negative, there is no valid argument, there is no valid conclusion. And finally, if we have 2 particular statements only, then we again have no conclusions. Deviations and defective arguments we call fallacies. A fallacy is a seeming argument, but one or more rules are violated in the process of argumentation, and therefore the argument is not valid. Of course, it is obvious that if premises are not true, false premises cannot give at any time a true statement. If I start my thinking with a false assertion, with some false belief at the very beginning in the premises, naturally I cannot arrive at true conclusion. So, deductive logic, and this is also important, gives us a absolute truth in the conclusion. It gives us absolute truth. That means if the rules are followed and the premises are true, the conclusions give me absolute truth. The second way of argumentation or mode of argumentation is called inductive thinking. Inductive thinking has another way. It comes from experiment, repeated experiment and confirmation of an experiment or experience, to a statement of a law of nature, of a law, a scientific law discovered, let's say, in a scientific theory. But let's first talk about deduction. The very old argument, probably known by anybody who has a little education, will be a model, so to speak, deductive thinking. All men are mortal. Premise 1. It has the universal statement: all men are mortal. It affirms mortality about all people. All men are mortal. This is a universal statement. And then we have singular or particular statement in the premise following. For example, Socrates is a man. And conclusion follows naturally. Socrates is a man. If all men are really mortal, that means subject to die someday, and Socrates is a man, then it follows necessarily that Socrates is mortal. However, it is essential to remember here the rules which we mentioned a few seconds ago. Once at least, the premise, the first premise, must be universal. If we would have two particulars only, there will be no argument at all. If we had two negative statements, there will be no conclusion at all. And the conclusion cannot contain more than the premises. In our example, all men are mortal, we have the universal premise, so-called major, and a particular singular in the minor, or the second premise. Socrates is man. The concept of man here is the medium. So we have here correct and valid argument, provided, of course, that the premises are true. Because we can have, and this is important to remember, we can have valid argumentation, but false conclusion. In other words, the argument will be a false argument, an apparent argument only. If, for example, we say, all cows are purple. Socrates is a cow. What follows? Socrates is purple. What is going on here? We have valid, according to rules, argumentation. We have one universal, all cows are purple. We have one singular, particular, Socrates is a cow. However, both statements are false. It simply is not the case that all cows are purple. not to talk about Socrates, because Socrates is not a cow. Normally we understand by the word Socrates a philosopher around 400 BC in Greece, a famous philosopher, a Greek. The conclusion, therefore, Socrates is purple, is, so to speak, validly deduced. It follows the rules of deductive argumentation. We have a universal premise, we have a particular statement and premise, a minor premise, and we have a conclusion. What is missing? The truth of the premises. Now it is obvious that if my premises are false, my argument is zero. So we can say that in deductive thinking, we have two basic rules that cannot be violated in any way. The argument is sound if the rules are followed. That means it is a valid argument, and the argument is sound if premises are true. If we have both conditions, then we have a deductive, sound argument. Arguments are neither true nor false. The premises may be so, but not the argument. The argument is either valid and sound or false. Then it is not an argument, but then we call it some sort of seeming argument only, or what in philosophy we call fallacies. Fallacies. A fallacy is a seeming argument at the first sight, but if we take a closer look, we realize that it is false. It has only the false appearance of correct thinking and argumentation. About fallacies, in some examples of fallacies, we shall talk soon later on in this lecture. Now, what is induction? Induction is, in a way, the opposite of deduction. The word deduction comes from Latin, means to deduce, to draw out, so to speak, something. Induction is to induce. In other words, induction starts with particular statements about reality, some particular observation, some particular discovery in science, but it moves towards generalization. And it is used. The induction is mainly used by scientists in so-called experimental sciences. Physics, classically speaking, mathematics, and so on. But basically, sciences which we consider particular sciences. Now, the purpose of induction is generalization of some discovery or observation, and from there building a theory ultimately based on regularity of events in nature. The root of induction is the belief that phenomena of nature behave in a regular way. If a scientist makes a discovery about some law, whether it will be in physics, biology, and so on, then by discovering, he is building some sort of interpretation of his discovery. And this interpretation, this interpretation must be validated by other scientists within his branch of knowledge, so to speak, biology, physics, and so on. So when the scientist makes this discovery, he is interpreting it, and he builds a hypothesis. But then by sharing this discovery with other scientists in his field, he gives the others opportunity to verify, to check by themselves that what he is giving in hypothesis is really the case. Once the hypothesis is validated by many other scientists, the hypothesis now becomes a scientific theory. However, it is important to remember that a scientific theory never gives us absolute truth, the kind of truth we get in deductive reasoning. Why? Because those theories and hypotheses and theories in science are all built on experimental testing, on some sort of possibility of weighing, measuring, and ultimately some kind of sense experience. Now, this sense experience, of course, should be understood in a broad way. When a scientist uses his microscope, he is in a way looking with a prolonged eye, so to speak. Minimized vision of eye. Microscope. Small vision, literally. But if he looks at the sky with a big telescope, then he again is using a augmented vision in a way. But in a way, both microscopes and telescopes and other equipment in building scientific theories are somehow finally subject to sense experience. Now, all those discoveries which we witness now in our times, the progress in different sciences, certainly are very impressive. But we must always remember that theories in science are changeable. No matter how subtle and how obvious a scientific theory seems to be, there can be in future some new discovery made in some area which will call for modification of the theory already accepted, or even of discarding this theory. Classic example of this is the theory of the structure of our heliocentric system, part of which is the structure and the movement of the globe, of Earth. For centuries and centuries it was believed that the Earth is the center of the Sun and the other planets, and man being situated on the center of this of this system, naturally would be like a center of the universe. But after Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and so on, we know that by no means are we on a very central planet. Our Earth really is a very tiny speck in the immensities of the grandeur of the cosmos, which is beyond any possibility of imagination. The galaxies, millions of them, are extremely gigantically big. And we, with our heliocentric system, being only a planet, one of the many, moving around, more or less around the sun, living on a small speck, a very insignificant in terms of dimensions, compared to the tremendous vagueness and big greatness of the cosmos. So in a manner of speaking, we can say that humans are little specks living on a little speck in the cosmos. Now, induction, therefore, is extremely useful, because it is precisely this that helps the scientist to make a progress in his own line of specialization. But this making progress, as already mentioned, sometimes will also undermine the previous explanations and theories, and that's why we said that scientific theories do not give us absolute truth, the kind of truth which we have in deduction, if we have validity of argumentation in deduction and truth of premises. Now, we said a few minutes ago that there is such a thing like seeming argument, and we call such arguments fallacies. A fallacy has the appearance of a valid argument, but really, because of some violation of some rules in the very process of argumentation, we somehow miss the truth and validity and soundness of the conclusions. Let's give some examples. I am here taking those examples from The Big Questions, 7th edition by Robert Salomon. Robert Salomon, Introduction to Philosophy. The philosopher from northern Greece is a well-known homosexual. Therefore, his claim that the universe is ultimately made up of atoms should be ignored. Both statements seem like an argument, but really there is no argument here at all. There are two statements: that there is a philosopher well known who is a homosexual. The second is the universe is ultimately made up of atoms should be ignored. That the theory that the universe is made up of atoms is false. Now, the not spelled here premise is the ground of those statements is that anyone who is a homosexual cannot develop true scientific theories. And we know this has no ground at all. It is simply false. A sexual preference of anyone, or even his sexual life of whatever nature, has not much to do with his mental capacity to develop true scientific theories. So the whole so-called argument here is simply a fallacy. Let's take one more. Every event in the world is caused by other events. Human actions and decisions are events in the world. Therefore, every human action and decision is caused by other events. What we have here, the first premise, is true. Every event in the world is caused by other events. That's true. And obviously what is suggested here is events, let's say like development of a thunderstorm, or let's say a big bang of the half-closed door in your apartment, burning of a house, let's say. A house does not just start burning by itself, so it has a cause. Fire has some source. But the conclusion is this: every human action and decision is caused by other events. What do we have here? We have a shift in the meaning of the word events. An event, like banging of a door or burning a house, has certainly a cause. The event of decision-making, human activity, is an event only in a metaphorical sense, not, however, in the sense just mentioned. Why? Because it is rooted in a free decision of an intelligent person having the ability to decide for or against something. So it cannot be simply compared to a mechanical event in nature, inanimate, based only in physical activities. Then we have also another fallacy. Believing in God makes people moral. That is, believers tend to do good and avoid evil. Is this an argument or not? Of course not. There are two statements, but no argument. First statement is, believing in God makes people moral. However, this is a sheer statement. There is no evidence given here. And we know that a simple statement has no value unless evidence is provided. Believers tend to do good and avoid evil is a second one. Now, it is not obvious that believers in God are necessarily tending to be good. We know a whole philosophical movement in 18th century called deism. Many of the savants and so on of 18th century, including the so-called fathers of the American Constitution, were deists. And deism means that philosopher who is a deist believes that God exists, that God created the universe, and that's it. He doesn't bother anymore. He, so to speak, once he, in a manner of speaking, naturally, finished creation, he let it go, and now the universe is developing on its own. And if this is so, there is very little, rather, place for the demand for morality. Because if God really doesn't care, then morality is a matter of human creation. And as such, it is subject to all kinds of human and sometimes brutal purposes. And then we have one more fallacy. God must exist. The Bible says so. The argument, God must exist, the Bible says so, again, is not a complete argument. God may exist or not. Bible is a book, a religious book, comparable to other books like Quran, for example, for the Muslims, or the sutras of the Buddha, and so on. Consequently, it is a question whether the Bible really is a true, compelling source of evidence for God's existence. As it stands, however, it needs also corroboration. In other words, only if we know that whatever the Bible says must necessarily be true, can we say that the existence of God is validated by the statements in the Bible. As it stands, however, here, now the veracity, the importance, the evidence seemingly here compelling that God exists is not validated. Let's take one more example. I have terrible news for you. Mary is going out with Frank. I called Mary on Saturday night, and she wasn't home. And then I tried to call Frank, and he wasn't home either. Conclusion, they are going together and you lost Mary. And this is probably said to some sort of lover, okay. Now, is this an argument, valid argument? Again, it is not. The fact that Mary and Frank were not home at the same time does not prove anything at all. Why? Because Mary could have gone shopping and Frank may have gone to a restaurant or to a barber and so on. So we have, of course, here again a fallacy. In order to make of this a valid argument, we would have to have absolute certainty that whenever both of them, Mary and Frank, are out of their apartments or homes, they always are going out together. This, however, we don't have here. So this argument, again, is nil, which means it has no persuasive, so to speak, quality. Okay. We have to go again now of some other fallacies which are called common informal fallacies. That means they are fallacies nevertheless, but in order to understand them, we have to get familiar with those seeming argumentations. Mere assertion is first. Mere assertion means that you make a statement. For example, an atheist says God does not exist. That's a mere statement. Now he has a right to say that. But in order to be in any way seriously listened to, he have to give reasons, he have to give arguments. What are the reasons for saying that God does not exist? And we know that atheists usually do give all kinds of what to their mind seems to be negating a fact of God, existence of God. The most universally adduced counter-argument against God's existence is the fact that there is evil in this world. If God is all good, if God is all omnipotent, why is there evil in this world? And to some people it seems incompatible, because being omnipotent and all good, he should have created, assuming that he is the creator of this world, he should have created a world in which there would be no evil. This is what it seems to be an argument. We must remember that the argument, if you take time to really analyze the whole thing, has no really intrinsic value at all. But it is adduced very often by atheists. The argument is, of course, very much loaded with emotion. Why suffering? Why dying? Why so much cruelty between one man and others, and so on? Why so many diseases and all that? Let's move forward. Once again, mere assertion is not evidence in any way. It is not argumentation. Begging the question is when proving something, repeating the same first premise. First you state something as true, and then going further, you are actually repeating the same thing, seemingly proving that in your argument what you intended to do. In the fact, for example, if we are trying to convince someone about the Bible, we have here, somebody may say, how do you know that God exists? Because the Bible says so. And then, roundabout, you repeat the same thing and come to the same question. We call this begging the question. Vicious circle is a very similar procedure too. Irrelevancies. In a discussion, an argumentation, we take examples which are not really connected with the main topic, with the problem at hand. And we can have all kinds of long speeches and so on, loaded emotionally, but de facto, when you actually analyze them very carefully, you will see that they are nothing of arguments at all. The ad hominem argument is a kind of threat, threatening somebody, trying to dominate someone by, so to speak, insinuating that if you do not follow, if you don't agree, if you resist, if you rebel, you will feel it because you can be arrested, imprisoned, criminally imprisoned for many years, or even perhaps executed, or somehow physically attacked. In other words, your very security and your existence is threatened, and the argument ad hominem means you attack really the individual. Not the case, not the matter at hand, but attacking the person. This is, of course, a fallacy. Then we have unclear and shifting conclusions, changing meanings. Changing meanings means that once a statement is used containing different meaning, and in the same argument, another statement, seemingly being a premise, has a different meaning in the same concept. People are free as long as they can think for themselves. Seems to be true. Second premise, prisoners in jail are free to think for themselves. Therefore, prisoners in jail are free. Now, the word free, of course, has a different meaning. It's one thing to freely be able to think for yourself. It's another thing is to feel free being imprisoned. A person imprisoned is not free physically. Why? Because he is a prisoner in jail. But he, if he is mentally normal, can think, of course, for himself. So the word free and applied to ability to think for yourself is one thing, and the word free applied to a prisoner actually in prison is another. We have changing meaning. Therefore, there is no argument at all here. Distraction is diverting attention from the matter at hand and other things. Dubious authority is claiming that so and so, such an institution, such an individual, such a person has qualifications that you must obey, and so on. This demand of obedience because such and such has the knowledge, the insight. This is used very, very widely in every society. The authority of a scientist, the authority of a doctor, the authority of some priest, and so on and so on. But authority can be very easily abused. And it so unfortunately happens that authority is quite often a vehicle of injustice and domination. Attacking a straw man, informal fallacies, and so on, pity, appeal to emotions, appeal to force, inappropriate arguments, and so on. All those are just examples of fallacies in logic. Human beings, of course, are not just disembodied minds who use the argumentation in clear and clean logical thinking. Human beings are people of desires, passions, purposes, all kinds of personal goals, and emotions, and so on. Consequently, logic or seeming logic is quite often used as in an improper way in those examples which we mentioned, in a fallacious way. And as anything in human existence, it can be abused naturally. And it is abused in many, many different situations throughout the history of mankind. It shows only that whenever we engage in any serious argumentation, we must be extremely careful first how we articulate our question. Number two, what possible answer would be a real and true answer if given. Three, if the argument is valid and sound, and if the conclusion really is answering the question, the problem. And all those other motives, emotions, feelings, and so on, should not be and are not part of logical thinking. This is why very often people behave in irrational way, illogical decisions, irrational motivations, all kinds of dominations, hostilities, and so on, are constantly all over the place. Why? Because logic is an art. It requires concentration and real determination. Which determination? A determination, an inner strong decision that I will follow wherever the argument leads me, no matter what. And a serious philosopher, a really developed human being, accepts and follows this line of thinking.